August 1971, in Seward, Alaska. A peaceful fishing town wedged between the mountains and the sea. It was the sort of town where nothing ever seemed to happen, until the day three men decided to rewrite that story. They showed up armed, reckless, and filled with a dangerous confidence, strolling right into the First National Bank, shotguns and pistols at the ready. In under 5 minutes, they vanished with $150,000, pulling off the largest bank heist in Alaska's history. But as it turned out, the robbery itself was the easy part. Getting away clean would prove to be impossible. As sirens blared and their gunmetal nova ripped through town, the mountains towered over them like a grim warning, and when they ditched the car to flee into the wilderness, they believed they were escaping to freedom. They were wrong. They were walking straight into a trap that would haunt the operation's ringleader, Paul Stavenji, for the rest of his days. Because 26 years later, he would disappear into the Alaskan wilderness once more. But this time, it wouldn't be about the money. Back in the summer of 1971, the small coastal town of Seward, Alaska, felt like the perfect spot to just vanish. Nestled between towering peaks and the icy waters of Resurrection Bay, it was a dead end, literally and figuratively. One road in and one road out. For most folks, that kind of isolation was exactly what gave Seward its charm. But for three young men with a reckless scheme, it would become their undoing. Paul Thomas Stavenji had been in trouble his whole life. Born in 1951, he spent his teen years bouncing between juvenile detention centers and courtrooms. By the time he was 20, he was already a seasoned criminal with a rap sheet that read like a warning. Breaking and entering, grand theft auto, and armed robbery. You name it. Paul had tried it. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to do. On paper, the plan was simple. The Seward branch of the First National Bank of Anchorage was located right in the heart of downtown. How tough could it really be for three armed men to just walk in, empty the cash drawers, and vanish into the vast Alaskan wilderness? They had the guns, they had a getaway car, and they had what they believed was a foolproof escape plan. What they didn't have, however, was a lick of common sense. On August 4th, 1971, at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, Paul Stavenji and his two partners in crime, Robert Garner Jett and Randall Morris Simmons, strolled through the main entrance of the Seward Bank. Each man was armed. Jett took up a position by the entrance, holding a shotgun, while Stephen, George, and Simmons, both brandishing pistols, ordered the employees and customers to get face down on the floor. The heist went down with chilling efficiency. The trio then forced the bank manager to open the vault, shoving stacks of cash into a large rubberized bag. Their take was enormous. $150,000, which is the equivalent of over $1 million today. It was a score that would go down as the biggest bank robbery in the history of Alaska. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Donald Riley was sitting in his squad car right across the street, after getting a call about suspicious activity at the bank. He watched, and he waited, fully aware that a confrontation with armed robbers on a busy street could put innocent lives at risk. Back inside the bank, Jett spotted the police and yelled at his partners to get a move on. The moment the robbers burst out of the bank and sprinted for their stolen getaway car, a tan and white 1964 Chevy Nova. Their problems were only just beginning. Lieutenant Riley immediately gave chase. Joined by several civilians who had witnessed the whole thing, the high-speed chase tore through the streets of Seward, hitting speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. And then came the decision that would seal their fate. Instead of trying to lose the cops on the open highway, the three men ditched their car at the foot of the imposing Mount Marathon and took off into the wilderness, lugging that heavy bag of stolen cash. They thought they were making a brilliant move. They figured the mountains would be their cover. Little did they know, they had just walked into one of the most unforgiving traps on the entire planet. The Kenai Mountains that loom over Seward are unforgiving, presenting extreme dangers to anyone without the right gear and preparation. Its steep ravines, dense brush, loose rock, and treacherous terrain have been the end for many experienced hikers and mountaineers. I've seen it with my own eyes. So for three young crooks hauling nearly 40 pounds of stolen cash, it was a guaranteed catastrophe. Paul Stavenji, Robert Jett, and Randy Simmons had planned their bank heist meticulously. But their escape plan was almost comically naive. They figured they could just hike over the mountains to the Kenai Peninsula and then head up north. In fact, Stavenji dreamed of settling near the Yukon River to live off the land as a trapper. But that was a fantasy about to have a violent collision with the harsh reality of the Alaskan frontier. Within just a few hours of hitting the wilderness, the trio knew they had made a huge mistake. The money they'd risked it all for had become an anchor, dragging them down. Completely exhausted and unable to make any real headway with their heavy bags, they made a desperate choice. They buried the cash in a thicket of alder trees, planning to circle back for it later. Meanwhile, back in Seward, one of the biggest manhunts in Alaskan history was kicking into high gear. The Alaska State Troopers, led by Captain Dan Church, were coordinating with FBI agents who had raced to the scene. They chartered a helicopter from Anchorage and brought in a tracking dog, an 8-year-old German shepherd named Height. The Civil Air Patrol ran search patterns until bad weather forced them to land. In total, 25 law enforcement officers and countless volunteers combed the wilderness around Mount Marathon. They located the abandoned getaway car pretty quickly, along with several sticks of dynamite the robbers had planned on using as a diversion. But the men themselves seemed to have just vanished. The decision to go their separate ways came on the evening of August 5th. After a cold, miserable night on the mountain, they decided that if they couldn't escape together, maybe one by one, they could blend in with the locals and find a way out of town. It was their last desperate play. Paul Stavenji, carrying $580 in cash and the .380 caliber Browning automatic he used in the robbery, set off by himself. Robert Jett and Randy Simmons stuck together, hoping that 2 of them could succeed where 3 had failed. Around midnight on Thursday, August 5th, Police Chief William T. Bagron was fighting off exhaustion after putting in more than 15 straight hours. He could have just gone home and left the search to his team. Instead, he decided to check one last spot: the woods near the country store on the Seward Highway. Sitting in his patrol car in the rain, Chief Bagron caught a flicker of movement, and there, stepping out of the woods and onto the highway, was Paul Stavenji. Stavenji was so lost in his own misery that he didn't even see the police cruiser parked just 50 feet away when Chief Bagron called out to him. Stavenji put up no resistance. The fight was completely gone from him. A search of his person revealed the pistol, the cash, ammunition, and what was later described as a dagger. The mountain escape had ended in absolute failure. With Paul Stavenji in custody, the net quickly began to close in on his accomplices. The authorities now had a name, and with a name came a criminal record that pointed them directly to Robert Jett and Randy Simmons. Jett and Simmons had remained a pair after the split, but they too were cold, hungry, and desperate when they finally ditched their mountain plan and snuck back into Seward. The exact story of their capture varies. Some reports say they were trying to blend into a crowd, others claim they were asking for help to get out of town, and one wild account has them getting arrested at a local diner while eating chili. Regardless of the details, by Friday morning, all 3 members of the gang were locked up in the Seward jail. Their grand escape had lasted just 3 days. The money they had risked everything for was recovered and returned to the bank. The legal fallout moved swiftly. Federal charges were filed, and the 3 men were transported to Anchorage for their arraignment. Staring down the barrel of long federal sentences, all 3 men eventually took plea deals, each getting 6 years behind bars. But for Paul Stavenji, this was just chapter 1. While his accomplices did their time and faded into obscurity, his story was far from over. Paul claimed he had bigger plans. He swore he was going to turn his life around, go straight, and for over 20 years, it actually looked like he might pull it off. When Paul Stavenji walked out of the federal penitentiary in Lompoc, California, in 1975, he was a changed man. Or at least, that's the story he sold to everyone, including himself. The bank robbery, he claimed, was just a mistake of his youth. He was older now, wiser, and he'd learned his lesson. For the next 2 decades, it really seemed like he had. Paul landed a job with the Alaska Railroad, repairing and inspecting tracks. It was honest, backbreaking work, and he was good at it. For the first time in his life, he was building something up instead of tearing it all down. He soon met Peggy Hoggerty, a waitress, who saw a spark in the reformed bank robber that most people would have missed. They got married, and together, they carved out a life in the wilderness near Chalitna, a remote area you could only get to by train, a snow machine, or a 3 or 4-wheeler. It was the kind of deep isolation that would drive most people mad, but for Paul, it was paradise. The couple lived in a dry cabin, no electricity, no running water, and 0 connection to the outside world, aside from the occasional passing train whistle. They had 2 children together, a daughter and a son, both born in 1984, and Paul fully embraced his role as a father and provider. But Paul Stavenji was more than just a railroad man and a family guy. During these quiet years, He tapped into an artistic side nobody could have seen coming. He started casting small pewter animals and buttons, incredibly detailed work that demanded both patience and skill. He carved wooden flutes, taught himself to play, and even began composing his own music. His scrimshaw work on ivory, bone, and antlers was so beautiful it sold in souvenir shops at the famous Alaska Fur Rendezvous. For 11 years, this was Paul's life out in Chalitna. He worked the railroad, created art, played his music, and raised his kids deep in the Alaskan wilderness. It was a true redemption story, one that seemed completely genuine. The ex-bank robber who'd found peace on the last frontier. But even paradise has its dark side. By the early 1990s, Peggy had grown weary of the isolation. Living off-grid was romantic in theory. But the harsh reality of no electricity, no running water, and no schools for the kids was wearing her down. She wanted a different kind of life, one with more of a connection to the outside world. Paul, maybe realizing his wife's happiness was important, agreed to the move. They bought 2.5 acres in Trapper Creek and built a new cabin, this one with a generator for electricity, but still no running water. Paul even picked up extra work, caring for special needs children on their school bus routes. But the marriage just couldn't survive the transition. In 1991, Paul and Peggy separated and then divorced. Peggy got full custody of both kids, and Paul was suddenly alone for the first time in almost 2 decades. On the surface, the divorce was amicable. They stayed friends, and Paul remained a big part of his kids' lives. But during the court proceedings, Peggy testified that Paul hadn't supported her emotionally or financially while she was washing dishes and cleaning houses just to make ends meet. She claimed he actually lost money on his crafts. It was a harsh take on their life together, but somehow, the split remained friendly. Still, Paul seemed to be holding it together. He had his art, his music, and he still had his relationship with his kids. He had successfully stayed out of trouble for over 20 years. The notorious bank robber who once made headlines was now just another middle-aged guy, trying to get by in the world with honest work and his art. But then came Memorial Day weekend, 1997. For Rick Barry and Debbie Rehor, the remote wilderness near Chalitna was supposed to be their slice of paradise. Rick, a 48-year-old electrician and a Vietnam vet, was on land his father had homesteaded. Debbie, at 40 years old, worked in customer service for the Matanuska Electric Association. Together, they built a large cabin on that property, their dream retirement home and a perfect weekend escape. Their cabin sat a full 8 miles from the park's highway, only reachable by a 4-wheeler in the summer and a snow machine in the winter. Their closest neighbor, about 1 mile away, was a man named Paul Stavenji. It should have been a peaceful setup, just 2 households living quietly in the vast Alaskan wilderness. But peace was the last thing they found. Tension had been brewing between the neighbors. Rick and Debbie suspected Paul was siphoning fuel from their cabin. Then, when Rick sold Paul a cell phone antenna, Paul just helped himself to a cable that wasn't part of the deal. When Rick demanded $50 for it, Paul allegedly chopped the cable into pieces before giving it back. Rick also had a strong suspicion that Paul had lifted a snow machine and a .22 caliber rifle from their property. Now, Rick Barry was a big guy with what friends called a hot temper, and he confronted Paul about the thefts more than once, but the issues were never settled. And so, the bad blood between the neighbors just continued to simmer. The Memorial Day weekend of 1997 was meant to be a quiet getaway for Rick and Debbie. Rick went up to the cabin a day early, with Debbie following on Friday after she got off work. She parked near the park's highway, where Rick met her on his 4-wheeler, and together, they rode off toward the cabin. Both were expected back at work on Tuesday, but when neither of them showed up, their bosses and coworkers knew something was wrong. Debbie's supervisor called her brother, Don Tidwell, and for him, alarm bells started ringing immediately. His sister was the definition of reliable and responsible. She would never just vanish without a word. Don raced out to the remote cabin to check on them. What he discovered there was deeply disturbing. The couple's 2 dogs were locked inside the cabin, clearly having gone without food for days. They had made a mess inside and were visibly distressed. Don knew his sister and Rick would never, ever abandon their pets, and his mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Don then hiked over to Paul's cabin to ask if he'd seen Rick and Debbie. Paul's answer was odd. He claimed he and Rick had a falling out and hadn't spoken in over a year, but Don picked up on what he would later describe as a, quote, strange vibe from Paul. As Don continued searching the property, he heard footsteps crunching on the trail behind him. He turned to see Paul Stavenji following him, claiming he decided to help with the search. The whole encounter left Don feeling deeply unsettled. He was convinced Paul knew a lot more about Rick and Debbie's disappearance than he was letting on. That night, Don bunkered down in Rick and Debbie's cabin with his gun close by, certain that something awful had happened to his family. On Wednesday morning, he called the Alaska State Troopers and officially reported Rick and Debbie missing. Troopers responded right away, and what they uncovered would confirm Don's absolute worst fears. Rick Barry's body was found on May 29th, lying in a creek just 2 miles from his cabin and only 200 feet from his abandoned four-wheeler. He had been shot in the head, execution style, at point-blank range. There was no sign of Debbie, and her four-wheeler was gone. A week later, on June 5th, Alaska State Troopers made another gruesome discovery. Debbie's body was located downstream from where they found Rick, partially hidden by grass and tree limbs. She was unclothed from the waist down and had also been shot in the head. The autopsy revealed she had been brutally violated around the time she was killed. All the evidence was starting to paint a truly horrifying picture. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, or a neighborly dispute that got out of hand. This was cold-blooded murder, preceded by a vicious assault. Paul Stavenji immediately tried to create an alibi, claiming he was in Fairbanks for the entire Memorial Day weekend. He gave investigators detailed information about restaurants where he'd supposedly eaten, and gas stations where he'd filled up. But when investigators started checking his story, none of it held up. Not a single person remembered seeing him at any of the locations he claimed to have been. And then, even more damning evidence surfaced, thanks to Gavin Sawa, a 21-year-old who happened to be camping nearby, reported seeing smoke rising from Stephen George's cabin chimney during the exact time Paul claimed he was in Fairbanks. Paul's carefully constructed timeline was starting to crumble. When investigators requested a DNA sample, Paul flat out refused. But with a court order in hand, he had no choice but to let a trooper take a swab from his mouth. Almost immediately after giving that sample, Paul Stavenji vanished. It wasn't long before railroad workers spotted him walking alone down the tracks, now clean-shaven after sporting a beard and mustache for years. Then, a railroad security guard saw him crash a red four-wheeler straight into a bridge before he bolted into the woods. When troopers inspected the wrecked vehicle, they made a critical discovery. It was Debbie's missing ATV. And then, the DNA results came back, and they were undeniable. The sample from Paul Stavenji's saliva was a direct match to the biological evidence recovered from Debbie Rehor's body. When combined with all the other evidence, the case against him was airtight. Arrest warrants were immediately issued, charging Paul with the first-degree murders of both Rick Barry and Debbie Rehor, along with sexual assault. The man known as Paul Stavenji had once again disappeared into the vast Alaskan wilderness, the very same wilderness that had thwarted his escape 26 years prior after a bank robbery. This time, however, he was far more prepared. Paul had spent decades immersed in the wild, learning its secrets and its rhythms. The manhunt that ensued was one of the most massive in Alaska's history, yet Paul managed to stay one step ahead for more than a month. Then, finally, on July 12th, nearly 7 weeks after the murders, Paul Stavenji placed a call to his attorney, Carmen Gutierrez, to arrange his surrender. He met her in Anchorage and then turned himself over to the Alaska State Troopers. Paul's story for his weeks on the run was surprisingly simple. He claimed he'd gone back to his cabin 2 times during the manhunt, once to grab Debbie's four-wheeler, and a second time after the search parties had moved on. He explained that when the security guard waved, he mistook him for a state trooper and panicked, which caused him to crash the ATV and take off on foot. From there, he made his way to Fairbanks, where he laid low for a week, then headed south to Homer, camping out for another 2 weeks, before he finally went back to his cabin and made the decision to give up. The subsequent trial in April of 1998 became a major media event. Paul's defense team, headed by Carmen Gutierrez and Jim McComas, put forward a story that was, to say the least, difficult to swallow. In their telling of the events, Rick Barry had stumbled upon his wife and Paul during a consensual encounter out in the wilderness. Paul alleged that upon discovering them, Rick opened fire, tragically and accidentally killing his own wife in the process. Paul claimed he then shot Rick purely in self-defense. The prosecution, led by Bill Estelle, dismissed Paul's entire testimony as a complete fabrication. The evidence stacked against him was staggering. The definitive DNA match, the stolen four-wheeler, the blatant lies about his alibi, and the sheer absurdity of his self-defense claim. In a truly bizarre courtroom moment, Paul's own attorneys asked him to play a song on his flute, the very same song he claimed to have played for Debbie right before their supposed encounter. The judge, seeing this spectacle, promptly dismissed the jury from the room. After deliberating for several days, the jury returned with a verdict. Paul Stavenji was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received a sentence of 198 years in prison, a term that guaranteed he would never be a free man again. The very same bank robber who had vanished into the Alaskan wilderness back in 1971 had re-emerged as something infinitely more sinister. A cold-blooded killer who not only ended his victims' lives but also shattered his own carefully crafted story of redemption. Paul Thomas Stavenji would live out the remainder of his days behind bars, serving as a chilling cautionary tale of the darkness that can hide behind even the most convincing mask of change. In the end, the same wilderness that had once bested a young bank robber also concealed the heinous crimes of a middle-aged murderer. But while Alaska's vast wildlands can hide many secrets, they cannot hide the truth from justice forever.